If you're new to Python, you might need a nudge to understand why we use variables and functions. Hello and welcome to the command line of my Linux system. A Linux system where we're going to be able to demonstrate to you why we use variables and why we use functions within our Python code. Now, to be honest, we're normally going to be working within a script editor, creating scripts. But this type of thing is probably a lot easier to show you from the command line, so we'll work directly at the Python interactive shell. So if I just type Python 3, that will open up the interactive shell. If you're using something like Windows, then typically it's going to be Python, not Python 3. But in either case, it's going to open up the shell. You can see straight away it gives us the Python version that we're using, so 3.10 in this case, but it also gives us some help messages. So if we go through and say type help, it then tells me, okay, well, we can get help from the full menu, or we can look at help on an object. And people often overlook this welcome screen when they go into the interactive shell, hence we can put it out here now. So if I go through and look at help on an integer, so help, parentheses, and then int for an integer, we can see then a little bit of the information about what we can do with numbers or integers. But that's not what we're primarily here for. We want to look at why we use variables and why we use functions. Now, a variable is an identifier for a value in your code. It's a bit like calling me dad. Well, that's kind of a variable, because in the context of my home, dad is going to mean me, and it says my kid's calling me Mr. Mallet, which is probably a little bit formal, but we don't really need it. If I wanted to print out an email address that we grab from a user, we can use our print function, and then we can use our input function. In our input function, we can then prompt for user input. So enter an email address. That's a string, so we put it in quotes. We can close off our input function, so the right parentheses there, but we also might want it in lowercase, so let's add in the .lower method, so lower and parentheses, and then close off our print function. You can see we're being prompted for our email address. We enter an email address, and then it gets printed out on the screen. So we can do it in one line. It's not the most pretty, but the bigger thing is I need to get that code again. Well, I can't. So if I go through now and actually just prove that the lowercase bit is working, or we put in Fred perhaps all in mixed case, then we can see all of that's working. But I don't have access to the value once it's been printed to the screen. We haven't stored it. So if I needed to do a check that the email address was valid, well, I'd have to try and do that all on that one line, which is then just getting ridiculous, isn't it? So if I clear my screen with a Control and L, we can then go ahead and set up our variable. The variables can be pretty much anything that you want, just don't start with a number, and variables should be defined in lowercase. So we can then go through and have our email address, assign the value of our input function. So again, enter an email address. I probably want a colon after this just for tidiness, and then close off the input function and then turn everything to lowercase. When I hit enter, we're going to populate the variable, so the prompt comes up. So this is my input function running, and we can then go through and let's do a mixed case again. So we don't get it printed out because I haven't asked for it to be printed out, but now we can go through and print our email address, and we can see then that it's fred@mail.com. But now I can access the value. So if I needed to check that it was a valid email address, well, now I can independently do that. I don't need to try and shoehorn everything into one line of code. To keep our check simple, I'm just going to go to the email address, and I'm going to use the count method, and I'm going to count the occurrences of the @ symbol. Now, the @ symbol is still going to be a quoted string. This literally is just counting how many ats I have, and I've got 1. I don't want any more, and I don't want any less than 1. If I've got 0, well, it's obviously not a valid email address, and if I've got multiple @ symbols, well, again, that's not going to be a valid email address. We can build then a test for this, so I can then go through and actually look for my email address count on the @ symbol being not equal to 1. So the exclamation mark in front of the equal means not equal to. I put a colon after that because we're now going to go into a block. Blocks inside of Python are indented, so everything that belongs to this if statement is going to be indented. Normally you indent 4 spaces, but for ease I'm just using 2 spaces here. So long as I'm consistent with my indentation, then it's going to work. And then we can print out an error message, and I'm just going to say not a valid email. And then we can go through and return, and just hit return again, and that gets me out of the block. We can see that it didn't return anything, so obviously the email was valid, the email address was valid. We'd already done the count and we had 1. However, if I want to test with a new email, I'm going to have to repeat those lines of code, including the indentation, which is not ideal. So this is where we use something similar to variables, and they are called functions. Now, a variable stores a value for reuse later. A function stores code for reuse later. We declare our function, or say we are creating a function, using the def for define keyword. We give it a name just like our variable, so check _email. And then functions can take input parameters. Here we're going to create a parameter. I'm going to call it email. Ideally, it should be different to the variable name to avoid confusion. So we're taking one input parameter here called email. Again, we have the colon to say that we're going into a block of code, and then we indent our 2 spaces inside of that for our if statement. And this is going to be the same, but instead of looking at email address, we're looking at our parameter email. So we can go through and put our check in place. But now I have to indent inside of my if statement. So 2 spaces, then another 2 spaces. So 4 spaces in total now to show that this code belongs to the if statement. We can then go through and print out our error message as it is. Obviously, we could do more code than this, but for the moment, again, let's just keep this simple. And then just hit our enter key twice, and that takes me out of the if statement and out of the function. So that's good now. I've defined a function, and then we can use this function as many times as we want. If I go back and just take a look at defining my email address again, I can go through and put Fred #mail.com. And then we can go through and check this. We can run check _email on the email address variable. And we can see that that's not a valid email. I can clear my screen again. And I don't have to go through the prompting to get another email address. I can actually just go through and do a check email. And then go through and put Fred @ and then mail.com. Again, here we're quoting it just so it knows that it is, in fact, now a string and not an identifier that we're going to. And again, that comes up okay. If we put a dash in the middle, so there is no @ then again, it comes back not a valid email. So we can see then how we can just run the function, and it runs all of the code associated with the function. So when we start looking at our variable is there to allow us to store a value, so we can use that value multiple times. And a function is not dissimilar, but it allows us to store code so we can run that code many times.
All that is left to say is thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, then you are probably sadder than I first thought. For more of this drivel, please subscribe, like and comment to @TheUrbanPenguin.